Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Today, we're going to talk about how to incorporate hardware gear into your DAW sessions. Let's get started. Today we're looking at how to create a hybrid workflow in your studio. And by hybrid, I mean combining outboard gear, whether it's in a 500 series rack like this, whether it's a rack mount unit, whether it's a Euro rack unit, whether it's another computer that you're working with, whether it's an iOS device, whatever it might be, hardware synthesizer, whatever it might be, we're going to talk about how to incorporate that into your DAW sessions. Now, it's actually very simple to do this. I'll be showing you how to do it using Studio One because it's got a pretty slick interface for making this all work, but it's the same for any DAW. And if you want more information, you can check out the videos that will accompany this at the links below on how to set up a hybrid workflow in Pro Tools, in Studio One, and in Ableton Live. So those will be coming at you as well. Using a hybrid workflow gives you a number of advantages over working just in the box. First, you can take advantage of analog sound quality, and that may mean things like tubes and transformers that color the signal in a particular way. You might also use an external piece of gear that there's no plug-in equivalent for, so you can access sounds that aren't available inside your DAW. Hybrid workflow also allows you to get more hands-on with your mixes, more an old-school kind of an approach where you're reaching out and grabbing a knob to make an adjustment. And for some reason, this seems to make things faster. And maybe most important, using outboard gear is just fun. It's fun to reach out, turn the controls, make the settings, be actually working with real studio gear in addition to what's happening virtually inside your DAW. So what do you need for a hybrid workflow with your studio? Of course, you need your DAW running inside a computer. You need an audio interface, and we're going to come back to that. And then you need outboard gear. That's really it. A key component in all this is your audio interface. Your audio interface needs to have enough inputs and outputs to support the gear that you want to connect, while also allowing you to still monitor through headphones and through your speakers. So for example, if you're using an Apollo Twin from Universal Audio, that has two outputs that you route to your monitors, and it has a second set of outputs, 3 and 4, that you could send in to a piece of gear or to two pieces of mono gear, and you come back in through the inputs. Other interfaces might give you more inputs, more outputs. It really depends on the interface that you're using, but the key is to have additional outputs over and above your monitor outputs and enough inputs to return your gear in. In my case today, I've got a Focusrite Red 8-line, and this gives me 8 line-level outputs and 8 line-level inputs as well. So what we're basically doing here is looping out of your channels or your tracks inside your DAW through the outboard gear and then coming back into your DAW for the mix down. How you do that varies a little bit depending on your DAW. As I mentioned, we have videos that'll show you how to do that for Pro Tools, Studio One, and Ableton Live. The concepts are going to be the same regardless of what DAW you're using. How they're implemented may be a little bit different, so you want to look at the manual, look at videos online, whatever it might be. So to begin, you connect your audio interface like usual to your DAW, but then you want to take those extra inputs and outputs and route them from your audio interface into your external gear. Now I've got a 500 series rack here. It's got 8 inputs, 8 outputs, and I've got my 8 inputs and 8 outputs coming from my Red 8 line, so I just route those consecutively. Output 1 from here to input 1 here, output 1 here, back to input 1 here, output 2 here to input 2 here, and so on. So we're just hooking them up so that we have access to the input and the output of each of these devices from within our audio interface. Now we also need to set that up inside our DAW so our interface routing is set up properly. I've already done that here. So if we go to our inputs, you can see that I've set things up where input 1 is the Lindell PEX 500. Input 2 is the Heritage Audio 73 Junior. I've got an AMS RMX reverb here, and this is an interesting unit because it's actually taking up 3 spaces, and we're not using that center input and output. So the input and output on this are actually on input 3 and input 5. And then input 6 is my SSL, and 7 and 8 is the West Audio Dione compressor. When we go to outputs, we set things up the same way. Main are already routed to our monitors, but you could also route those to the PEX and to the 73 Junior. We've got our RMX on 3 and 5. We're skipping 4 because there's nothing there. Then our SSL is on 6. The Dione is on 7 and 8. So once you have that set up, your gear is all patched, and now we can access all of it from inside our DAW. So what I've created here is a session where I've got addictive drums running in a track, and then I've broken out the kick and the snare drums onto separate mono tracks. So if I play that back, this is my main stereo drum mix. The kick is being sent here, the snare is being sent here, so we can process those separately using our analog hardware. Now to route our audio out of the DAW and into our hardware and back in, they have a very slick way of doing this in Studio One, and it's with a plugin that's called Pipeline. So let's scroll down here. In this case, we're sending a mono signal because we're just sending the kick drum. I want to send it through the SSL EQ. So let's select the SSL as our output that we're sending here, and then we'll also bring it back in. We could also choose to name this plugin. So we could rename that and we'll call it SSL EQ so we can clearly see what it is. We can name the device if we like. And now when we play back, we can see on the meters the signal is being sent out and it's also coming back. So it's routing through this SSL. So if let's make some adjustments here. We'll boost up the bottom end on this. We'll say at about 100 hertz. We'll boost that. We'll boost some highs on it. We're going to cut a little mids and upper mids. And now I'll bring that in and out. So you can hear the change there that's happening when we go from the EQ engaged to the EQ bypassed. So it's routing through this Pipeline XT plugin to do that. It's very slick. Now, as I mentioned, there are some other features. When you're sending out through your audio interface, going through a device, coming back through your audio interface, that takes a very small amount of time. It's called latency. If you combine these signals together when you're doing your mix, you may in some cases have some problems with phase cancellation and with problems with that latency creating timing errors. Pipeline XT actually has an automatic feature that will compensate for that. So if we click auto, what it does is it sends a pulse out, brings that pulse back in. The orange line here is the original dry signal. The blue line is the signal coming back in, and it will automatically line it up. You can see we dropped to -1 samples. We can manually adjust that as well. And you can see that it's changing how those line up when we do that. So if we bring it back in to 1 sample where it automatically set it, you can see that we're now perfectly in line with phase. Other DAWs have different ways for compensating for latency with their sends and returns in this way. In Pro Tools, for example, there's a hardware insert delay that you can set. In Ableton Live, there's a slider that allows you to adjust latency and so on. So there's usually a way to do that within your DAW so you can keep things lined up and phase accurate. That's really all there is to setting up an insert inside your DAW. You simply set up your hardware, cable it all together, set up your I/O so it's routed properly, and then you can just insert things where you need them. So in this case, we put our SSL EQ just on the kick drum. We can also insert on the master bus. We could go down here, choose another instance of Pipeline. We'll make this one stereo. And let's choose our dione, which is our bus compressor. We'll make sure our latency is set properly. Everything's lined up there. We can rename this to dione so we can see that. Now we'll turn this off, and when we hit play, we'll be playing through our stereo compressor. Very slick. But we're not done yet. There's another way you can use external hardware inside your DAW, and that's on aux sends and returns or effects sends and returns. You'd usually do this with reverbs and delays, time-based effects, where you'd be blending the reverb or the delayed signal back in with the dry signal. To do this, we'll add 2 aux channels so we can bring the left and the right of the RMX back in. So we'll add aux channel. We'll call this verb left. Call this verb right. Okay. Now we want to set our inputs for those channels to 5 and 3. So once we have our returns set up, we'll pan those left and right because we've got a stereo return coming back. We're sending in mono from here, so we can send from just one side. We'll choose the right, and now when we play, we should hear reverb on our snare. So what we're doing is the signal is coming through our channel strip. It's being sent out into one side of the AMS. It's creating a stereo reverb that's then coming back on our 2 aux input channels here, verb left, verb right. We could group those 2 channels together, which makes it a little easier to manage them. And now as we adjust levels, they'll work together. And if we mute, solo, and so on, they'll be grouped. So we play back. Now I want to show you one other thing that's very cool that's available in some hardware devices. this dione in particular, but there's other devices that support this as well. Bettermaker is one manufacturer that also does this. And that's that there are actually plugins available that can control some of these devices. So I've got a USB cable here coming from my computer. I can plug this in to the front of this dione module. And now on the master, we'll insert a plug-in here for the dione. We'll link that up to the USB connection. And now we've got a direct connection from this plug-in to this hardware box. If we turn a knob, it changes on the hardware as well. If we bypass or activate, it does the exact same thing on the hardware. And in fact, it works the other way as well. If I change the knob here, it changes the setting inside the plugin. Now all these settings inside the plugin are stored along with your session. So once you do that, now when you open your session up, this Wes audio device will go back to exactly where you had it set for that particular session. It's a very cool way to automate and to have presets available for an analog device like this compressor. Up to this point, we've looked at using 500 series gear interfaced into our DAW, but that's not the only way you can do things. For example, we could easily use rack gear just as well. 500 series, of course, is a convenient format. It's very space-conscious format, but using a piece of rack gear, we just connect it to our audio interface in the same way. Then we just have to set up our I/O inside our DAW in the same way. Here's our inputs coming back from the Drummer 1976, and here's our outputs that will feed to the Drummer 1976. Now I want to insert this hardware piece into our DAW session. This is a Drummer 1976, which is a 3-band processor you can use to saturate the different bands separately, and then you can also increase the stereo width as well using this. So it's something that you typically use on your stereo output bus. So we'll go ahead and insert our pipeline stereo on our master outputs here, our 2-bus, as it's sometimes called. We'll set our send to 7 and 8, which is the 1976. Bring that back in. We can see we've got signal here on our send, our return, as well as on the drummer. Now we can do our latency here. Set that up so we have no latency, and we're ready to go. So close this up, hit play. Now, I'm a big fan of using stereo bus processing like this, whether it's a mastering processor or a bus compressor, stereo EQ on the output. I like to mix through those devices, and so this is a great way to do it. You can just insert them right into your DAW. And we can even go further than that. We could use guitar pedals in our mixes. To do that, you need an interface box. I've got the Radial EXTC here, which is a reamp box, sends out from your DAW and then into the pedal, from the pedal back into this, and then back into your DAW. But it works in the exact same way that everything we've been looking at so far does, and it allows you to use any guitar pedal inside your mix. We could also incorporate Eurorack processors, or I've got a reverb, for example, that runs inside my iPad. With an audio interface on the iPad, I could work back and forth using that by inserting it right into my session. So there's a lot of flexibility here, a lot of possibilities that we can explore for adding processing and new sounds into our DAW mixes. Now, one thing I do want to make you aware of, and that's that most DAWs, when you do a offline or a non-real-time bounce to create your stereo mix, they don't include outboard processing that's been interfaced with the DAW. So in that case, you want to do a real-time bounce so that you're sure you include what's happening with any outboard gear you might have that's in your mix. Another possibility would be to record the outboard gear onto new audio tracks and include it in the mix in that way. There's one other aspect of this hybrid workflow that we should touch on, and that's using a summing mixer or a mixing console along with your DAW. To do this, we simply route the tracks out of the DAW to individual outputs coming from the audio interface, and then connect those individual outputs into the inputs on our mixer. So in this case, I'm bringing 8 outputs from my Focusrite audio interface into the inputs on my SSL mixer. The SSL mixer is combining everything down to stereo for me. Now I could insert gear in between that signal path. I could still use all the routing capability inside the mixer. I could still use plugins and insert devices inside Studio One. But it's a very simple way to combine everything together and have it right here in the analog domain. So for example, in this case, on this input, I've got my room mics. So stereo room mics are coming in. Let's mute everything else. So room mix there. This is my kick and my snare. On this input, I've got my overheads. And this is my toms. One tom hit there. And we can combine everything together. So it's yet another way that we can incorporate analog or external hardware into our DAW sessions. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to how you set up a hybrid workflow using your DAW. It's very simple to do. You need an audio interface with multiple inputs and outputs. You have to set up your I/O inside your DAW, connect your gear, and then you can just insert it right into your tracks and get to work. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click here for more videos like this, or start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.